Here is 4.2, find a GCF. Greatest common factor here is 5. So then what goes in the parentheses? Divide each of those terms by 5. You're left with x and 2. For 2, GCF. Well, 2 goes into all of those. This one doesn't have an x, so you can't factor out an x. So 2 is the GCF. Divide by 2. You get 2, well, 2's out in front, and then 2 divided by 2 is just x squared. And then 10 divided by 2 is 5. Bring the x down. Drop the negative sign down. 8 divided by 2 is 4. Number 3, GCF is 3. And this term right there does not have an x, so you can't factor out an x. So you're left with 3x squared plus 2x divided by 3. And negative, careful, 3 divided by 3 is 1, right? $3 divided by 3 people. Each person gets $1. GCF on number 4 is 2. And then I have x to the third, x to the second, and x to the 1. So they do have an x in common, but you can only take out the smallest power. So what they have in common is a power of 1. So x to the power of 1. So divide by 2x to the 1 to figure out what goes in the parentheses. So 8, don't start doing goofy math, folks. This says 8 divided by 2. That is 4. Then, this is x squared. I took out x to the 1, so I'm left with x to the 2. You subtract the powers when dividing the same bases. Drop down your minus sign. And for this middle term, 2 divided by 2 is 1. You can write down that 1 like I just did if you want to, or really you can just leave it blank. But then the variables, x squared divided by x to the 1 is x to the 1. I shouldn't say leave it blank. If everything canceled out, then you'd have to have a 1 there to hold that spot, to have something to distribute the GCF by to get that term. All right, next, drop down the plus sign that I just kind of circled through. And then 12 divided by 2 is 6. And then here, x to the 1 divided by x to the 1. You're dividing something by itself, so you don't get an x. It's just 6. The x to the 1 you took out, you factored out. So there's no x's for this term. But when you do distribute to check, 2x times 6 is 12x to the 1. So I factored that correctly, because you can check factoring by multiplying. Number 5, you can factor out a 5 and an x to the 4. Then you're left with 2x minus 1. Next, GCF here is going to be, well, you can't factor a number out. So there's a 1 in front of that, negative x to the 4th, negative 1x to the 4th it is. But you can factor out x to the 3rd, because they all have x's in common. They all have x's, and the smallest power is x to the 3. So we're not going to actually change the coefficients this time in the parentheses. Now what changes is the powers. So 3x squared, negative 1x. And then here the x cubes cancel out, and you just get positive 4. That's the answer. Again, if you distribute that in, you get the original term, or the original polynomial. Factor by grouping, here we go. Hug the first 2, hug the last 2. GCF here is x squared. And when you take that out, you're left with x plus 5. GCF here is 4, so you're left with x plus 5. Oh, coincidence? No, they better cook up that way. So then you get x squared plus 4 times x plus 5. Number 8, group. You can factor out a 2x squared. So you get 4x plus 1. See, this is what I'm talking about right here. The 2's cancel out. I shouldn't say cancel. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So that's why I wrote a 1 down. And I especially have to write the 1 down because the x squareds do cancel out. So I have to have this because you can check this again by multiplying. If you don't have a 1 there, 2x squared times anything else is not 2x squared. It's got to be 1. 2x squared times 1 is 2x squared. What can I factor out of the second parentheses? A 4 plus 4. It's a positive 4, so I put a plus down. Then when I divide, oh my lord, don't write that down. My GCF there is 5. When I divide by 5, I'm left with 4x plus 1. These match, don't they? Oh yeah. So then bring the 2x squared and the positive 5 together, and you get 4x plus 1 as the other factor. There we are. Hug, hug. Ooh, and the third term is negative, folks. I do a little choppy slashy. Hug, hug. So you can factor out a 5x squared out of this first one. And when you do that, you're left with, let's see here, the 5's cancel out, or become 1. So I can write a 1 down, but really I do have something here. X cubed divided by x squared is just x. So you can have that 1 in front of the x, or you can just leave it. Either way, when you FOIL that or multiply that back together, when you multiply that back together, you get 5x to the third. Drop down your plus sign. Here, 5 divided by 5 is 1, and x squared divided by x squared cancels out. So here's where, what do I put here? It has to be a 1, because 5x squared times 1 is 5x squared. Now, what can you factor out of this second parentheses right here? A lot of people would say, well, nothing. But in factor by grouping, if there's nothing to factor out a 1. I know it's like the only time that we GCF something that's 1, and we actually factor out the 1. But in this case, you actually don't want to factor out just 1, you want to factor out a negative 1. Because when you divide both of these by negative 1, you're left with a positive x, which matches the positive x in the blue parentheses, and negative 1 divided by negative 1 is positive 1, which matches the blue positive 1 in the other parentheses. So now, folks, we do have matching parentheses, x plus 1, x plus 1. Take your mini GCFs, take your mini GCFs, and put them together. Now, we had to factor out a negative 1, so it's 5x squared minus 1 times x plus 1, the matching binomials. All right, number 10, let's see, what can we factor out of here? It looks like a 4 and x squared. And when I do that, I'm left with a 5x minus 1. What can I factor? Oops, I forgot to even put the parentheses around. I was getting kind of excited there. Oh, I got to chop slash this. And the third term is negative. Make it obnoxiously negative. So see, when I put that parentheses in, I can still see that it's negative. What should I factor out of that second parentheses? 5 seems to maybe make sense initially, but when I do that, my signs are not going to match this parentheses right here. I'll do it quickly. So like this is not right, folks. If I just put a 5 down, then I'm going to get a negative 5x and a positive 1. So factor out a negative 5. Divide by negative 5. And you get a positive 5x and a negative 1. So now we get 4x squared minus 5 times 5x minus 1. And if you were to FOIL that back together, folks, you get the original polynomial, which is beautiful. I'll tell you, check it on a test, because your answers aren't going to be on the back of your packet, or the back of your paper for your test. The last couple here. Factor out a 4x squared. Oh, lordy. Mr. P was just kidding. Mr. P needs some more coffee. You can factor out an x squared. You can't factor out a 4. Just an x squared. Just an x squared. So you're left with, let's see here, 4x, but I'm looking forward to that coffee and not to that GCF out in front. There. Put your GCF out in front. So you're left with 4x and then plus, and here's where x squared divided by x squared is 1. It's important we have a 1 there. See, that's a positive 16. So what can we factor out of these last two? Positive 4. And when you divide by that GCF, you're left with 4x. And again, 4 divided by 4 is 1. Our binomials match, so we get x squared plus 4 times, ooh, that looks messy, times 4x plus 1. The last one, group them, can factor an x squared out. So you get x minus 2. And out of this last parentheses, what can you factor out here? A 1 or a negative 1. There's a right option there and there's a wrong option. Take a look at what we want to have in that parentheses. We want this parentheses that I'm making right now to be x minus 2. And that's actually what I already have up there. So what am I factoring out? Well, just a 1. If you can factor by grouping, when you can't factor anything out, bring out a 1, folks. 1 times x is x. 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. So you get x squared plus 1 times x minus 2. There it is. If you foil that back together, oh yeah, it looks good. All right.